We've talked this morning about how the Scriptures tremendously value the age, the life experience and wisdom that comes with age. But we've also noted that the Scriptures also highly value youth, that's never to be a barrier to really being poured out with a passion and a devotion and an energy and a strength. So how do we make sense of that? A value on age and a value on youth? Could it be that it's necessary in the midst of God's people that there be both? That God's people be inclusive of those of all generations if we're really going to live out the calling that God has or the expectation that God has for His people. Might it be that both of those things are necessary and important to the people of God fulfilling their purpose? Let's come back to what we started with in Psalm 145. Notice what is said there in verse 4. One generation commends your works to another. They tell of your mighty acts. They speak of the glorious splendor of your majesty. And then the individual appropriation of that. And I will meditate on your wonderful works. They tell, that generation, tell of your power and your awesome works. That leads me then, and I will proclaim your great deeds. They celebrate your abundant goodness and joyfully sing of your righteousness. What happens? What is the place where one generation commends the works of God to another? How does that happen among the people of God if one generation is not brought together with another generation around the table? You see, God even designed some of the practices for His people to communicate that very idea, to be strategically inclusive of those of all generations so that one generation might commend His works to another. Think with me of the Passover celebration that the people of God had, the Israelites. Remembering back to that moment as they were preparing to leave Egypt, when God intervened on their behalf and struck down the firstborn of every home, unless the doorpost was marked with the blood of the lamb that had been sacrificed for them. How did God's people remember that? What was to be the way that they continually proclaimed or commended the works of God in saving His people to others who had yet to hear about it? It was in the celebration of the Passover meal, where people of all generations were brought together around the table, and even symbols and tastes and smells were used to help tell the story, help remember as a people, and to help one generation commend their work, the works of God, to another. Notice what we read in Exodus chapter 12, verse 24, in a description of this. Obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. When you enter the land that the Lord will give you as He promised, observe this ceremony, the Passover. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Then tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when He struck down the Egyptians. And then the people bowed down and worshipped. You see, the Passover meal was a practice that intentionally brought together the generations, the older and the younger, around the same table, where one generation could commend the works of God to another. In fact, the very design of the Passover meal incorporates that strategy. There are questions that the youngest at the table is to ask of the older ones. Why is it that we do this? Why every year on this night do we eat these kinds of foods, and do we read these passages of Scripture, and do we talk about these kinds of things? And the older generation is to say, well, here, let me tell you that story. Let me tell you about a time that God intervened on our behalf. Let me commend to you the works of God. And as they do that, then that younger generation begins to see and to understand and to know with faith and trust and confidence what that God can do on their behalf. You see, the Passover meal is a beautiful illustration of what happens when there are multiple generations in the people of God gathered together around the table. Understand that the consequences of not having that happen, the consequences of not having one generation commend the works of God to another are terrible. They're deadly. And we actually catch a glimpse of what happens there in the book of Judges. At the very beginning, chapter 2 of the book of Judges, to place that in historical context, the people of God had come into the promised land. Under the leadership of Joshua, they have conquered much of the land, and they have settled there, and they have come to know what it means to be God's people in that place. But that generation that accomplished that went the way that every generation had before. They aged. They grew old, and eventually they pass away. And in Judges chapter 2, we read about their passing. Chapter 2, verse 8. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Ares in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Joshua and all of the other people in that generation die. That in itself sounds kind of just natural, and it's kind of the course of history. But notice what we read in the very next verse, Judges chapter 2, verse 10. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord or what he had done for Israel. Those are terrible words. Another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. What are the consequences when one generation fails to commend the works of God to another, and that generation fails to listen, hear, understand, and embrace? You get the rest of the book of Judges. And if you read that, you'll discover that things were horrible. It was not a good thing. It was not a pretty picture. It was destruction, and it was violence, and it was judgment, and it was failure, and it was battle, and it was not the kind of life that God would desire for his people. Friends, one of the reasons it's so important for us as the mosaic of God's people, as the gathering of those who are very different, but all gathered as the part of one people, one of the very important features of that is bringing together people of different ages and generations. There is an incredible value in bringing the generations together around the table. One of the things I love to see when we have fellowship events after services on a Sunday is the gathering of those generations around the table. You see, a lot of times, if we do like the Super Bowl Sunday or the chili cook-off or a dinner or luncheon, we tend to find that a lot of people of one age gather at one table and a lot of people of another age gather at another table. But each year there's one or two tables where you see, because of the intentionality of those who are at the table, you see a person of one generation and maybe from a couple generations much farther down the road than them, and maybe even sprinkled in one more generation, that all end up around the same table together. And at some point in the conversation, they get beyond whether or not it's cold outside or whether it rained this week, and some of those kind of surface level conversations that we have, and they really begin. They begin to tell a story of what God has done in their life, perhaps. And one generation begins to commend to another the works of God, the marvelous works of God, so that that generation can hear and know who the Lord is and what he has done for his people. I'll close with this. None of you would know who Tata Siemens is. Tata was a retired missionary from India who lived in the town where I grew up. I was a little kid, but we all knew about Tata. He was in his 90s, I think, at that time. He was an older man. And most of the older men in the town where we grew up really didn't have a lot of patience for some of the craziness and energy of youth. In our town, there was a Christian music festival, outdoor Christian music festival, every April that drew several thousand young people to the town, literally a crowd of 15,000 people on the hillside outside of town. It was a crazy time in the town. Teenagers walking all over the place, lots of energy, craziness, funny things going on. And a lot of the older people in town really didn't have a lot of patience for all of that. And you'd find even that many older people in town might lock up their doors and just stay in the house and stay out of the chaos of all that was unfolding there. You might find some older people who even every year intentionally left town on that weekend for a trip so that they wouldn't have to be in the midst of all of that. But Tata didn't do either of those things. He didn't hole up in his house somewhere. He didn't take a trip to make sure that he would be out of town. In fact, you wouldn't have found him outside of town or in his home during that time. You would have found him actually in the center of the crowd at the Christian Music Festival. It was rock music. It was not the kind of music that Tata loved personally. But he understood that something was going on that hillside that was really important. That the gospel message was being shared with a younger generation in a way that they could hear it. And Tata didn't want to miss out on that. He was there with his fold-up lawn chair and his tambourine. And he would sit through concert after concert after concert of music that really wasn't his thing, banging his tambourine and praying as God's message was declared to that hillside, because he understood that what was happening on that hillside was a generation commending the works of God to another. And he wanted to make sure that he didn't miss out on being a part of that. Now there's a cost to that. Sometimes one has to set aside their preferences or the things that they like. Sometimes an older couple has to endure the crazy stories of little kids who are sitting around their kitchen table eating cookies with them. But when that older couple understands that what they're giving up in order to be a part of that moment gives them a power of influence in the lives of those younger people, and a bunch of crazy little kids that are sitting around the table eating cookies also begin to understand slowly that if they take some time to sit down with some older people they normally wouldn't be hanging out with, they might just gain an insight of wisdom that they never would have gotten on their own. Friends, if we're going to be the people of God that God desires that we should be, if we're going to be the strongest, wisest, most passionate and devoted group of people who are having an influence for the kingdom in our city, we're going to have to be a people who have folks from various ages, various seasons of life, various generations who are brought together around the table so that one generation may commend the mighty works of God to another.